During the period 1485 to 1509, trade and expansion grew due to the desires for exploration from the many Bristol merchants, and especially that of John Cabot, under the guide of Henry VII.
The search for the mythical island of Brazil and the seven cities was of vast importance to England from the 1480 onwards, mainly due to British fishing interests. This would attract attention and would be beneficial to the English trade due to the large amount of salt fish that were supposedly freely available in the area. The advancement of map drawing was of critical influence to exploration at this time. The more discoveries that were made across the world, the more maps would be drawn up and would contribute to exploration on a wider scale. Since Brazil appeared on many maps on many different locations without actually have been discovered in practice, this would have contributed to a large number of explorers actually attempting to discover the isle.
I mean, actual advancements in map drawing, I think in that period, I mean, there's not sort of huge technical advances at map drawing at that time, but what you do obviously get is the sort of the inclusion of the New World in that period, and going up to things like sort of, I guess, the VII map and so on.
According to Bristol merchant John Day, in a letter reporting to Spanish explorers, England discovered America before 1497. He stated that it is considered certain that the Cape of the said land was found and discovered in the past by the men from Bristol who found Brazil, as your lordship knows. It was called the land of Brazil, and it is assumed and believed to be the mainland that the men from Bristol found. On the 15th of July, 1480, a ship owned by a man named John Jay left for Bristol in search of this mythical island of Brazil. However, documents have shown that shortly after, the ships returned due to bad weather. The following year, on the 6th of July, two ships called the George and the Trinity, both Bristol ships, left Bristol port to once again search and find a certain isle called the Isle of Brazil. It seems from recovered documents, however, that this voyage was also unsuccessful, and the Isle of Brazil remained undiscovered, at this time anyway. The search for the Isle of Brazil did not end here. In 1527, Robert Thorne the Younger claimed that his father, Robert Thorne the Elder, as well as a man named Hugh Elliot, both merchants of Bristol, were discoverers of the newfound lands. There are two possibilities that arise from this claim. Either both these men set on an expedition between the voyages of 1480 to 81, but before Cabot, probably around 1494, or that they were part of Cabot's later 1497 voyage. The latter is more likely, but the former still deserves some recognition due to the lack of primary information available in this respect. The chance of Thorne and Elliot discovering Brazil in 1494 before Cabot is not highly unlikely. Clearly then, from 1480, if not earlier, the merchants of Bristol were intent on the discovery of land in the Atlantic, and that in the 1490s their efforts were intensified. The land sought was the mythical island of Brazil. The hints pointing to a 1494 discovery by Thorne and Elliot prove on analysis to be of slight value. On the contrary, the evidence so far quoted gives no ground for stating positively that there was a discovery at any time. Nevertheless, there is a discovery at some point in this period, and it is generally supposed that Cabot's voyages were launched from Bristol because of the port's established interest in the Atlantic exploration. In today's modern age, the city of Bristol is bursting with tribute to John Cabot. However, a shocking majority of the general public know very little about the 15th century explorer and his navigation to success. So, exactly who was this acclaimed individual?
Contrary to popular belief, John Cabot was far from Bristolian. The explorer was named Giovanni Caboto after being born in Italy roughly around 1450. It was not until 1495 that he travelled to England for the first time. After getting into financial difficulties, the Italian merchant turned his ambitions to navigating and exploration. Having failed to persuade both Seville and Lisbon to fund him, Cabot thought he'd try his luck in England. As a result, St. Nicholas Street in Bristol was to be his last ever home.
After numerous attempts to gain support throughout Europe proved unsuccessful, Cabot and his sons were finally granted royal backing in March of 1496. This lawful agreement with the English king was to benefit both parties involved. It was a win-win situation. Cabot and his crew were given the right to explore all lands unknown to Christians, whilst being exempt from paying customs on the goods that they brought back. Consequently, just a few months after receiving this patent, Cabot was prepared to sail the Atlantic Ocean in search of foreign lands. By this time, he had moved to Bristol with his sons in order to gain local merchant support. After all, this city was built upon trade and was the second biggest in England. Little is known about this provisional voyage due to its lack of documentation. However, a single letter from a Bristol merchant to Christopher Columbus serves as proof that the journey was not as successful as first hoped. John Day wrote of one ship, a confused crew, short supplies and bad weather, all of which resulted in the premature return of Cabot and his crew, having discovered nothing new. The 2nd of May 1497 saw Cabot and a crew of 18 men set sail once again for new discoveries.
On the 4th of June 1497, 35 days after departing from Bristol, Cabot and his crew made landfall. At the time, this land was believed to be Africa, yet now we know it was more likely to be Newfoundland. Staying on the ships for safety, the group of 20 men spent the following 30 days investigating and charting the coastline. Although they did not actually see any inhabitants, they did witness signs of life.
On the 6th of August, the group returned and were met with tremendous enthusiasm. It was believed the voyage had opened up a new and wealthy trade for England. Henry VII demonstrated his gratitude by rewarding Cabot with a single instalment of £10 and an annual pension of £20. Indeed, after witnessing the success of Cabot's second voyage, Henry VII decided to grant a second patent to the explorer and his crew. This patent allowed full exploration of the new land. As a result, in May 1498, Cabot departed from Bristol once again. Yet this time he was followed by a more substantial congregation. However, much like the first voyage, information on this third exploration ceases to exist. In 1789, William Barrett was the first to claim that the main ship was called the Matthew. We know that after the simultaneous departure of the 5 ships, bad weather resulted in damage to one of these vessels, forcing it to dock in Ireland. The fate of the other 4 ships will never be known.
Still to this day, a historiographical debate surrounds Cabot's third and final voyage. John Allen suggests the only land Cabot reached on his third voyage was nowhere but on the very bottom of the ocean, to which he is thought to have descended together with his boat. Other historians believe a lack of evidence does not necessarily mean complete failure.
However, if either was true of Cabot's fate, one thing remains unresolved. A £20 pension from the king was collected every year for some time after the fleet's disappearance. Peter Firstbrook suggests an alternative possibility. Quite simply, Cabot returned disgraced and was never heard of again.
We have found some evidence which suggests that possibly Cabot did return by sort of 1500. I mean, things relating to pension payments, things relating to legal records which refer to some of the people who know sailed with him in 1498.
As for the trade John Cabot brought back to Bristol through his 3 voyages, it was far less impressive than first thought. Cabot's aim was to open up trading links with Asia in order to import expensive spices. Instead, he discovered land that was considerably less wealthy and merely brought back large quantities of fish.
In the early 15th century, fishermen from the eastern ports began to sail to Iceland for cod, and the men of Bristol did the like. Also during the period, leading Bristol merchants who had grants of privileges from the Crown had presence in the Azores and, closer to home, Ireland. In the late medieval and early modern period, Bristol was considered one of England's most important ports. An average of 22% of England's total wine imports came into Bristol in the 15th century, making it the 2nd largest importer of wine after London. Bristol's overseas trade was also made up of the importation of luxury goods, usually supplied through southern Europe. Wine was not an easy trade, however, and mariners on the Bordeaux-Bristol voyage had always faced the dangers of storm and shipwreck, particularly since these were autumn and winter voyages, after the vintage had been harvested. Bristol also traded with Spain, and more so following the 1489 Treaty of Medina del Campo, which encouraged trade relations between England and Spain by allowing ensured safe conduct for ships and privileges for English merchants in Spain. Due to this, by the 1490s, over half of Bristol's cloth exports went to Spain, and by 1500, Spain was supplying 1/3 of Bristol's wine imports. The famous association between Bristol and Iberian wine originated in the age of Cabot. To further Anglo-Spanish trade, Henry VII created an alliance with Ferdinand and Isabella. Laden with cloth from the looms of the Cotswolds, ships from Bristol went to the Basque ports for iron and wood, to Seville for almonds, figs, dates, raisins, and oil for soap.
So, there's a steady improvement in Anglo-Castilian relations over the latter half of the 15th century, and Spanish trade grows enormously. And I think one of the things about Iceland is that people always, yes, there was an Icelandic trade, but it was only ever at its height probably accounted for about a couple of percent, perhaps 2-3% of Bristol's trade. Whereas by the end of the 15th century, Spanish trade is probably accounting for around about roughly 40% or so.
While relatively little is known of William Weston, this is not a reflection of his importance, as Weston was the first Englishman, being from Bristol, to lead an expedition to North America in either 1499 or 1500, reaching as far as Hudson Bay. Perhaps his contribution to Atlantic exploration has been overshadowed by other popular figures of the time, such as John Cabot. It was not until 2007 that William Weston became known to the historical community with the discovery of new documents. Significantly, it was discovered that Weston was a supporter of Cabot and was indeed involved in John Cabot's voyage from Bristol in 1497-8, which resulted in the European discovery of North America. After working with Cabot, Weston led his own expedition, and evidence has been found that Henry VII himself rewarded Weston for his efforts.
Perhaps the most significant find relating to Weston was a letter written by Henry VII concerning Weston, which was found by a former assistant keeper at the National Archives. The letter in question was addressed to Henry's Archbishop John Morton, and it instructs the Lord Chancellor to suspend legal proceedings against Weston, as Henry wanted Weston to complete his trip and shortly, with God's grace, hasten sail for to search and find it, if he can, the newfound land. These legal issues were in fact the evidence of Weston from his property, purchased by his father. Henry VII in fact personally financed Weston's expedition in either 1499 or 1500, giving Weston a sum of £49, which was more than the sum paid to John Cabot by the king. Therefore, we can assume that the king was very pleased with Weston and his efforts.
Prior to exploring the Atlantic, William Weston traded with Portugal almost exclusively between the 1460s and 1480s. However, while the records of his use of Bristol port are regular, they are not to a standard which would suggest he was a lone trader. Rather, it appears that he was an agent for established Bristol merchants. William Weston was also the first to voyage directly to one of the Atlantic islands from Bristol in 1480. This island was Madeira, and his reasons for attempting to open up a trade route with Madeira were possibly related to his connection with Lisbon, Portugal. Weston had died by February 1505, soon after his last expedition.
Between 1485 and 1500, Bristol roughly imported 24,000 tons of wine and exported 83,000 cloths. But trade started to become restricted as the Hanseatic League influenced the Danish king, which was a German-dominated trading confederation. This was the case until Henry VII insisted on freedom of trade in the Treaty of 1490. But Bristol's seamen and others were not satisfied with the extensive development of their trade with Iceland or the Baltic, as it did not compensate for the loss of the Gascon trade. Many Bristol men and those of other leading ports began to open up new fields for commerce in unsailed northern seas. From 1490 to 1510, there was a steady inflation of values for 3 to 8 or 9 marks. Changes in the cloth industry, increasing competition in overseas markets, such as Bordeaux, and voyages to Newfoundland probably all played a part. The trade of Bristol was different to that of London and Southampton, as it was entirely in the hands of the merchants from the southwest of England and carried direct to and from the Spanish ports in their own ships. It is therefore unsurprising that not only by accident that the merchants and ship owners from Bristol and other southwestern ports were to play an important role in the expansion of English overseas enterprise, not only in the West Indies, but to Brazil and North America. Like Spain, they would convert the former ocean barrier into a highway of exploration, commerce and immigration. After a brief interval following the death of John Cabot, between 1501 and 1505, there was a return to a new phase of annual sailing from Bristol to the northwest Atlantic. The new phase was launched with the award, on the 19th of March 1501, to a group of Englishmen and 3 Portuguese from the Azores. It granted them the authority to seek, occupy and possess lands still unknown to Christians. The voyages of exploration took place in 1501 and 1502 and is proved first by a gift of £5 on the 7th of January 1502 to men of Bristol who found the isle, and secondly by the payment in September of that year of small rewards to mariners who presented the king with hawks and an eagle, together with a more substantial grant of £20 to the merchants of Bristol that had been in the new-found land. Clues to the precise destination of their voyages are limited, but we do not know that having manners of brute beasts and speaking an unintelligible language. They were most probably members of the indigenous population of North America. Some have suggested Eskimos, and they are surely the first to reach England. Conclusions may be made that the voyages from 1501 to 1505 for the purpose of exploration and the exploitation for their own sake of the newly found lands of the New World, generally still referred to as islands. It is highly unlikely that the merchants who invested would do so without some prospect of returns through trade or barter.
By and large, the trade and expansion of the English Empire can be seen as ever increasing due to the influence of these noteworthy voyages in this period. The clear reasoning behind these expeditions from 1480 to 1509 were clearly implemented by Henry VII himself to increase English trade and therefore going on to benefit the English economy. On the contrary, there was also another underlying influence in that the incentive to discover new lands would have given these significant explorers a claim to fame, and it certainly worked in John Cabot's case.